The letter arrived on a Tuesday in November, folded inside a larger envelope addressed in a hand Cecily did not recognize, and it found her at her usual place behind the copying desk in the back room of Hartwell & Sons, her fingers ink-stained. Her posture that particular uprightness of a woman who has learned to take up exactly as little space as she is permitted. She read it twice before she understood what it was asking of her. A third reading confirmed it. The envelope bore the Ashmore seal in dark red wax, and the letter within requested her attendance at Ashmore Hall at her earliest convenience on a matter relating to the estate of the late Richard Alderton, Earl of Ashmore, and certain documents pertaining to her late mother, Miss Anne Hartwell. Cecily had not expected to hear that name in connection with that house. She sat very still for a long moment. The copying pen was still in her right hand. Outside the narrow window, the November street went on with its business. She became aware that her left hand had moved without her permission into the pocket of her gray wool gown, where her mother's silver thimble lived, and she was turning it between her fingers, in the way she had been turning it since she was 7 years old, and it had been pressed into her small palm by her grandfather, with the words, "This was hers. You should have it." The solicitor's name at the bottom of the letter was not her grandfather's. It was a name she did not know. She had not yet risen from the copying desk when the outer door opened and she heard Lady Miriam Ashmore's voice, low and unhurried, saying to whoever accompanied her, "I expect old Hartwell's little error will be resolved before the week is out. These things tend to collapse under examination. The copyist girl has no claim that any serious person will entertain." The voice passed through. A door closed. Cecily set the pen down carefully. She was 24 years old. She had been told the shape of her history early and plainly, in the manner her grandfather preferred, not cruelly, but without ornament. Her mother, Anne Hartwell, had been a gentlewoman of modest means, the daughter of a country clergyman who had formed an attachment to the Earl of Ashmore in the spring of 1800. The attachment had been, in the phrase used, imprudent. There had been a child, Cecily, born in 1802, after the attachment had been severed and the Earl had contracted a more appropriate marriage. Her mother had died of a fever in 1803, when Cecily was not yet 2 years old, and the Earl had made a small provision for the child's keeping, which Cecily's grandfather had accepted without gratitude and applied without discussion. That was all. That had always been all. Her grandfather, Mr. Thomas Hartwell, was a solicitor of the old school, a man who believed that precision was a form of kindness, and that ambiguity was its own species of cruelty. He had given Cecily a desk in his firm when she was 16, and a legal education he had not advertised. She could copy a contract with fewer errors than his paid clerks. She could read a conveyance deed in half the time. She had, in the 7 years since, never asked him to explain what the Earl had meant to her mother, because she had long since come to believe that some questions are not doors, but walls, and that walking into them produces only bruises. She had grown into a woman who expected at most to be useful. The thimble was smooth beneath her thumb, worn at the crown where her mother's thumb had worn it before her. Cecily returned it to her pocket, folded the letter precisely at its original creases, and went to find her grandfather. He was in his own room at his own desk, and he looked up when she entered with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not quite guilt, not quite grief, but something between the two. The look of a man who has been carrying a particular piece of weight for a very long time and has just heard the sound of it beginning to shift. "I have had the same letter," he said. She set hers on the desk between them. He did not look at it. "Grandfather," she said, "what does it mean?" He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Outside, the November wind moved through the street. A carriage passed. When he finally spoke, his voice was level in the way that her voice was level. "The Hartwell manner, the manner of people who do not permit themselves the luxury of falling apart until the situation has been resolved. It means," he said, "that a man named Edmund Carew, Viscount Rathmore, has found something in the Alderswick Parish Register that he believes you should know about. If she did not know about it, He was not going to tell it to her before the Viscount did. She saw that. She accepted it. She did not sleep well. She lay in her narrow bed in the room she had occupied since childhood, with the letter on the table beside her, and the thimble in her palm, and she thought about what it would mean if the entry meant what it appeared to mean. And then she thought about what it would mean for the hierarchy of a county that had organized itself for 16 years around a particular story. And then she thought about her mother, who had married the Earl of Ashmore on a March morning in a small church and had not lived to see her daughter grow old enough to ask questions. She put the thimble back on the table and folded her hands on the coverlet and made herself breathe evenly. She traveled to Ashmore Hall the following morning in her grandfather's small carriage, with her good gloves and her better coat and the thimble in her pocket. The hall sat 12 miles from the town, at the end of a gravel drive lined with lime trees, stripped bare by the season, and it presented itself to her with the self-possession of a house that has never required anyone's approval. Stone, gray gold in the thin November light. 3 stories. The kind of proportions that existed before proportion was discussed. She had driven past its park wall once or twice in her life at a distance and had not permitted herself to look for long. The footman who admitted her did so with perfect neutrality, which she noted as a form of kindness. She passed through a hall of considerable height with portraits on the walls and a marble floor, whose footsteps she was careful not to let be too loud. She had the sense, walking through it, of a house that did not particularly require her to be impressive, which was, in its way, a more frightening quality than vanity would have been. A second footman led her to the estate study, which was a room of dark wood and ordered papers, smelling of ink and winter, and a fire that had been lit some time ago and was now doing its work with quiet competence. Edmund Carew, Viscount Rathmore, was waiting for her in the estate study. He was 33 or perhaps 34, tall in the way of men who do not think about it, with dark hair worn close, and a face that might have been called handsome if its chief quality had not been a kind of deliberate stillness, as though feeling were a lamp he had set behind glass some years ago, and chosen not to fetch out. His coat was navy, his cravat exact, and he was standing when she entered, which she had not expected. He did not sit until she had been offered a chair. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was even. "Thank you for coming." "My lord," she said. He did not offer pleasantries. She was grateful for that. He lifted a volume from the desk, a large bound register, its cover dark with age and handling, and he laid it open before her to a particular page. The entry had been marked with a slip of paper. He placed his finger below it without touching the ink, and said, "Read the entry for the 14th of March, 1801. She read it. The handwriting was a former vicar's, careful and old-fashioned, the letters formed with the care of a man who understood that what he wrote would outlast him. The entry recorded a marriage, performed on the 14th of March, 1801 in the parish of Alderswick, between Richard James Alderton, Earl of Ashmore, and Anne Margaret Hartwell, spinster, of this parish, in the presence of 2 witnesses whose names she did not recognize. She sat very still. She read it a second time. The ink was faded at the edges but perfectly legible at the center. The signatures at the foot of the entry were the Earl's and her mother's and the vicar's and the 2 witnesses. Her mother's hand was unfamiliar to her. She had died before Cecily could have learned what her handwriting looked like, and yet she recognized it. The way one sometimes recognizes a voice in a dream. "The marriage in September of 1802, Edmund said carefully. "The marriage that produced Lady Miriam's position as Countess was contracted before any record of the dissolution of this marriage, or of your mother's death. Your mother, Miss Hartwell, did not die until the spring of 1803, some months after the second ceremony." Cecily said nothing. "Which means," he continued with the same precise quietness, "that the second marriage was void. The first was never dissolved. Your mother was the lawful Countess of Ashmore from March of 1801 until her death. And you are the lawful legitimate daughter of that marriage." She became aware that her hands were folded in her lap with great precision, as though they had decided on their own to hold themselves together. "Sit down, Miss Hartwell," he said after a moment, and she almost told him that she was already sitting. and then she understood that it was not instruction but something else, something that did not have a more useful word. She nodded. Once, outside the study windows, the lime trees stood in their November patience. She asked him 2 questions before she left the study. The first was whether her grandfather had known. He said he believed her grandfather had suspected, but had never had access to the register. The second was whether Lady Miriam had been informed. He said she had. His expression, conveying this, was that of a man who has done a precise and necessary thing and understood its cost. She thanked him. She rose. She walked out of the study and down the corridor, and when she reached the estate chapel, a small stone room off the side passage, with 3 pews and a window of colored glass, the room she had somehow known to walk to without meaning to, she went inside and sat in the front pew with the register she had asked to carry, and she read her mother's name again. She did not weep. She had known, without ever articulating it, that weeping was something she would do later, privately, in her own room, in her grandfather's house, when no one could see the precise shape of what she had been told. For now she read the entry again, and then she said her mother's name aloud. Once, in the steady voice she had been perfecting since childhood. Anne Margaret Hartwell. The colored glass caught what little light November permitted, and cast it in pale gold and blue across the stone floor. She was still sitting in that posture, straight-backed, quiet, both hands folded over the open register in her lap, when she became aware, without quite hearing a sound, that she was not alone. She did not turn immediately. She had grown too accustomed to the presence of watchers who passed on without stopping, and she had learned not to rearrange herself for the benefit of an audience that had not asked her permission to be one. She sat for another breath. The colored light on the stone floor had shifted slightly, as December afternoon light does when a cloud moves. She thought about her mother sitting in this parish, perhaps in this church, or one very like it, and marrying a man who had, by all evidence available to Cecily, loved her enough to record it, and then had not loved her enough to protect what the record contained. She closed the register carefully, as though she were returning something to a person who had not known it was missing. And she rose. Edmund was in the doorway. He said nothing. His face had done something she did not quite have a name for. She looked at him for one moment directly, which was not what one did with viscounts in doorways, and saw that he had been standing there for some time, had not announced himself, and that his hands at his sides were absolutely still in the way that hands become still when a person is making a deliberate effort to impose quiet on themselves. She inclined her head and walked past him into the passage, and he stepped aside to let her. And neither of them spoke. And there was, in that silence, something she was not ready to examine. The county gathering at Barton Hall was 3 days later, a dinner of 20 covers, with the usual assembly afterward, and Cecily attended at her grandfather's side because he was not yet well enough to refuse invitations with authority, and because they had both understood, without saying, that to stay away would be read as retreat. Lady Miriam was there. She wore a deep blue gown that she wore well, and diamonds that she wore better, and the confidence of a woman who has occupied a position for 16 years and cannot quite believe it is being contested. She was 52, or perhaps 53, and she was the kind of handsome that belongs to women who have decided not to let time have its way with them, without a fight. She stood at the center of the room with the authority of a person whose authority has never been publicly questioned. Cecily wore her best gray silk and her mother's thimble and the expression she had been practicing for 24 years. Edmund was present at the far end of the room, speaking with a group of gentlemen. Cecily did not know. His back partly toward her. His posture, the same careful stillness she had catalogued in the study. It was the cousin, Miss Honoria Alderton, a composed young woman in pale yellow, whom the dowager had been placing at Edmund's elbow throughout the season, who first spoke to Cecily, with the unintentional cruelty of the socially secure, asking if she found the room warm, and implying, in the particular way that required no particular word, that a copyist from the town found rooms such as this rather warmer than she was used to. Cecily said she found the room entirely comfortable. Lady Miriam's voice from 3 persons away arrived as though she had been waiting for exactly this opening. She said to Lady Rushmore beside her that it was a pity old sentimentality had produced such confusion, that old Hartwell had been a loyal enough solicitor in his day, but had never quite distinguished between what a document said and what one wished it to say, and that the claim of that copyist girl was the kind of thing that would not survive the scrutiny of serious examination. Lady Rushmore made a sympathetic sound. Cecily heard it all. She was meant to. She looked toward Edmund without deciding to. He was turned slightly toward the room, which meant he had heard, or was near enough to have heard, and his face was entirely still, and he said nothing. And the absence of speech in a man who was executor of the estate, and who had himself placed the register entry before her 3 days ago, was something that landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She did not blame him for it in the way one blames a person who has made a choice against you. What she recognized, standing in Lady Miriam's drawing room with the warmth of 14 candles on her face and the cold weight of her grandfather's hand on her arm, was that she had somewhere in the 3 days between the estate study and this room tormented herself to believe that Edmund's having placed the register before her meant that he had chosen her side, which was not something she had been given any reason to believe, and was, when examined honestly, a hope she had not been entitled to construct from the material available. She was in the end still the copyist's granddaughter, standing in a drawing room she had entered at the sufferance of its owner. She did not stay long after dinner. She made her excuses with a composure that had never yet failed her in a public room, which was the only composure she had ever reliably owned. She made her excuses. She was quiet in the carriage home, and her grandfather was quiet beside her. And the dark closed around the windows in the way November dark does without ceremony. That night, in the small library off the upper corridor, Edmund stood alone before the portrait of his uncle, the late Earl, and thought about what he had not said in the Barton Hall drawing room. The late Earl looked back at him with the particular blankness of the painted. End. Edmund had been the late Earl's nephew and eventually his executor, and he had for most of his adult life organized his feelings about Richard Alderton into the clean categories the law provided, because the law provided better categories than the human heart. He had been 24 when Margaret Finch had chosen his older cousin, for the security of a higher income and a larger house, and he had told himself then, with the precision he had been cultivating since boyhood, that it was simply information, that what a woman chose told you what she valued, that he had built something incorrect. He had since built nothing in that direction, and had been systematically rewarded by his own assessment for the decision. He was useful. He managed the estate with competence that no one disputed. He had not spoken at Barton Hall because speaking would have been a declaration. And declarations, he had understood for 9 years, were the mechanism by which you made yourself available to be wrong. He had watched Cecily Hartwell sit in the estate chapel and read her mother's name aloud in a steady voice, with her back straight and her hand still, and he had felt something shift in the architecture of his certainty in a way that had no precise legal equivalent. He went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well. The third voicing reached Cecily through her grandfather's footman, who had it from a housemaid at Ashmore Hall, who reported it to the old solicitor with the particular distress of a loyal servant, reporting that Lady Miriam had told the assembled guests after Cecily and her grandfather had departed Barton Hall that the matter was all but settled, that the solicitor's little error had already been corrected, that anyone who had entertained the claim for even a moment could rest easy as the register in question had certain irregularities that would be resolved in her favor before the new year. Cecily's grandfather received this in the front parlor of his house, sitting in his chair, with Cecily beside him. He was 71 and had made the journey to Barton Hall at some cost to himself, and his face had the particular gray quality that made her keep one hand near his, where he could not see it well enough to object. When the footman had gone, she sat with him in the quiet for a while. She was not afraid of Miriam's solicitors. She was not afraid, precisely, of the threat. What she was afraid of was something less manageable. that her mother's name, which had been concealed for 16 years beneath the story of a shameful attachment, would be concealed for 16 more, and that the woman who had concealed it would go on wearing the life that had belonged, by law and by the pain of a marriage performed in March in a cold little church, to someone who had loved the Earl in the only way she knew, and had been buried without her true name attached to what she had been. She stayed with her grandfather until he slept. Then she went to her own room and allowed herself in the dark, with her back against the closed door, to feel the specific weight of what it meant to be the person who was owed a reckoning that no one was going to deliver on her behalf. She had been told by the practical arrangement of her circumstances that this was simply how things went, that the machinery of the social world was not designed to correct itself, that the entry in the register was a fact, but facts required advocates, and that advocates required authority, and that the authority in question had stood in a well-lit drawing room. She knew, standing in her dark room with her back against the door, that she was not wrong to feel this as a specific abandonment, because it was one, and she had also been trained since childhood to name things accurately, even when the naming was uncomfortable. Her mother had been accurate, she thought. But in March of a year she had not lived to see repeated. Her mother had stood in a cold church and married a man who had presumably looked at her and chosen her, and she had given him her signature, and her future, and her name, and the name had been taken from her, and now the register held it, and the register would be disputed by people with London solicitors and drawing rooms, and 16 years of the assumption of right on their side. She did not weep. She was her grandfather's granddaughter, which meant she believed, in the manner of solicitors, that grief was not an argument, and that arguments were what the mourning required. She turned the thimble between her fingers for a long time. In the morning she dressed in her good coat and her good gloves, told no one where she was going, and went to the Alderswick parish church. The current vicar was a Mr. Prex Penrose, young and conscientious, who had not been born when the entry was made, and who received Cecily, in his small vestry, with the slightly nervous courtesy of a man who has recently been the subject of correspondence from 2 different solicitors about a single document. She explained herself plainly. She did not invoke his name or her own potential title or any form of authority she did not yet legally possess. She told him that she was her mother's daughter, that her mother's hand was in his register, and that she wished to know whether a certified copy of the entry, under the vicar's own seal, witnessed, and legally attestable, was something he could provide. Mr. Penrose consulted his register. He consulted his conscience. He said he believed it was. She waited in the cold vestry for the time it took him to prepare it properly. It was not a long wait. It was, however, a quiet one, and the quality of the quiet was particular. The vestry smelled of old paper and stone, and the particular cold that inhabits ecclesiastical rooms even in June, and she sat in the straight wooden chair and looked at a print of the Annunciation on the wall opposite, and thought about the category of action she had just taken. She had not told her grandfather. She had not waited for Edmund to act. She had arrived here in her good coat with nothing but her mother's name in her mouth, and the knowledge that what she was asking for was simply the truth, accurately stated by the person authorized to state it, and that this was a thing she had the right to request from the man who had the authority to grant it, regardless of what any viscount chose to do. The thimble was in her pocket, and her hands were in her lap, and she sat in that cold vestry in the posture she had been practicing since childhood, and she found that it was enough to be here, doing the thing that required doing, without anyone's help and without anyone's witness. Mr. Penrose returned with the certified copy under his seal. His expression, handing it to her, was that of a man who has done what he believes to be right, and is slightly astonished to find that it was this. Simple. She thanked him. She rose. She left with a sealed and certified copy, carefully folded in the inside pocket of her coat. Edmund learned of it that afternoon from Mr. Cawtry. Penrose, who sent him a note in the same post that contained his reply to Lady Miriam's solicitor's inquiry. He sat at the estate desk and read it twice. He sat with it for a while. Outside, the November light was thinning toward 3 o'clock. He thought about what it cost to walk into a cold church vestry without rank or legal backing, or the protection of any name, and ask for what you were owed. He thought about his own silence at Barton Hall. He thought about these two things in sequence, and found that the second shed a particular quality of light on the first. Lady Miriam had called the gathering herself. She had done it with the confidence of a woman who believes, from 16 years of experience, that her drawing room is the room in which the verdicts are made. She had sent cards to 14 households in the county, had arranged the tea, had placed the rival's cousin at her own right hand, and had waited for Edmund as the executor who would confirm, before witnesses, that the legal challenge had been resolved and that she remained incontestably Countess of Ashmore. Cecily arrived with her grandfather, who leaned on his stick and kept his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been keeping secrets for a very long time and intends to be present when they are opened. The drawing room was full. There were 14 people and 2 fireplaces, and the smell of tea and good wood smoke, and Lady Miriam standing at the room's head with the poise of a woman who has rehearsed this afternoon with some care. Edmund was there. He was near the window, which meant he had come early enough to choose his position, which meant something Cecily did not let herself examine. Lady Miriam began to speak. She thanked everyone for coming. She explained in the smooth and polished cadences of the socially authoritative that a small difficulty had arisen in the settling of the late Earl's estate, that a document had been introduced in evidence of a claim she could only describe as fabricated, and that she had engaged the finest legal minds in London to examine the matter, and that the examination had concluded in her favor, and that she intended to close the subject this afternoon, before the assembled company, so that there would be no further confusion about the matter. She paused. Edmund crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He crossed it in the measured way of a man who has decided to do something deliberate, and is not going to be hurried out of the deliberateness of it. Several people turned. Several others stopped mid-conversation. The room did what rooms do when a person with authority and gravity begins to move toward something. It held itself briefly, in a kind of collective attention. He stopped at the room's center. He said, addressing no one in the room in particular, and therefore everyone, "I am sorry to interrupt." He did not sound particularly sorry. "There is a legal matter that requires the room's attention before this afternoon proceeds any further," Lady Miriam said. "Very precisely, I was speaking. Lord Rathmore." "You were," he said. "You were speaking about a document you have described as fabricated. The document in question is a certified entry from the Parish Register of Alderswick, bearing the signature of the Reverend John Coles, who performed the marriage, and the signature of the Earl of Ashmore himself, and the signature of the woman whose name she now carried, who was, from the 14th of March, 1801, until the spring of 1803, the lawful Countess of Ashmore. The room was very quiet. He reached into his coat and produced 2 documents. He held them separately, with the precision of a man who has thought about how this moment should be arranged, and has arranged it accordingly. The first was the certified copy, under Mr. Penrose's seal. The second was a letter from a London solicitor he had engaged, independently separate from Lady Miriam's engagement, whose opinion was attached. He set them on the table at the room's center. "I am the executor of this estate," he said. "My function is to ensure that its affairs are settled in accordance with law and with the wishes of the late Earl, to the best of my ability to determine them. I have determined that the woman who made the legal claim presented to me last week in this house acted correctly, and that the claim is substantiated." He turned to look at Cecily. She had not moved from the doorway, where she stood, with her grandfather. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and the room turned with him, all 14 faces, and Lady Miriam's fan stilled in her hand, and Miss Honoria Alderton looked at the floor, "is the lawful daughter of this house." He said it plainly. He said it with no flourish and no triumph and no cruelty, and the 12 words landed in the drawing room, the way a stone breaks the surface of still water, without ceremony and entirely irreversibly. Lady Miriam did not fragment loudly. She was not that kind of woman. She went very still, in the manner of a person whose entire script has just failed in a public place, and whose dignity is the only territory she has left. She said nothing for a breath, and then she said quietly, I see. It was not much. It was everything she could manage. Lady Rushmore said from across the room in the wondering tone of a woman recalibrating, "But she is that woman's daughter. I remember her. She had a good face." A pause. She had a good face. No one contradicted this. Cecily's grandfather made a sound that was not quite a word and was not quite a sob, but was the sound of a man who has been holding something for 22 years and has just been relieved of it. Cecily did not move from the doorway for a moment. She was aware of Edmund watching her from across the room, with an expression she could not fully read, and she was aware of the thimble pressing against her hip through the wool of her pocket, and she was aware that she did not feel triumph. She felt instead the particular quiet of a thing that has been wrong for a very long time, and has finally, without spectacle, been corrected. The legal resolution required another 4 weeks. Lady Miriam's solicitors examined the documents, consulted the London opinion, and withdrew. The matter was not adjudicated in a court, because Lady Miriam had the dignity, when it came to it, not to force one. She removed to her family's house in Wiltshire in the 2nd week of December, and she did so without speaking to Cecily again, which Cecily did not hold against her. She was a woman whose world had been built in a particular place, and had been dismantled in the same place, and grief of that kind, however unearned, was still grief. Edmund handled the correspondence. He handled it with the precision she had come to recognize as his default expression of care. He called on her grandfather twice during those 4 weeks on matters pertaining to the estate documentation. On both occasions, he stayed for tea and spoke with the old solicitor about the legal particulars and about other things. And on the second occasion, he remained after her grandfather had excused himself for his rest, and he and Cecily sat in the front parlor with the tea growing cold between them and the fire doing its work against the December weather. She asked him, because she could not quite leave it unasked, why he had said nothing at Barton Hall. He did not look away. He said, in the even voice she now understood was his natural register and not a performance, "I was afraid." She had not expected that word. "Of being wrong?" she asked. "Of being right," he said, "and of what that required of me." She considered this. The fire shifted and resettled. "I collected the certified copy myself," she said, not as rebuke, but as information. "You did," he said. "I heard about it from Mr. Penrose the same afternoon." He paused. "I sat with the news of it for some time." He looked at the fire for a moment and then back at her, and there was in his face something she had been watching accumulate over the course of 4 weeks, something that had begun as a quality of attention in the estate chapel doorway and had been growing ever since, precise and quiet, and not quite willing to be named until it was ready. "That I had been operating under a particular arrangement for 9 years, he said, "which I had told myself was wisdom, and which was, in fact, cowardice dressed in the vocabulary of caution, and that I would prefer not to continue." Cecily held this. "Lord Rathmore," she said. "Edmund," he said, "if you will." It was the same deliberateness with which he had crossed the drawing-room, the same careful irreversibility. She allowed herself for the first time in a very long time to want something. The sensation was unfamiliar, like pressing weight onto a foot that has been numb, and finding it can bear the pressure after all. "Edmund," she said. 3 weeks later, on the last day of December, the legal formalities fully completed, she walked with him in her grandfather's garden in the cold afternoon light. The garden was small and walled, the kind that in summer would smell of rosemary and lavender, and now smelled only of stone and cold, and the particular clean quality of December air. The gravel was frozen underfoot. Their breath made small visible shapes between them. He had asked, in the formal way, whether he might call upon her. She had said, yes. He had said he would call tomorrow. She had said the morning suited her. He had said the morning suited him as well. It was not, by any objective measure, a declaration. It was, by every measure that mattered, entirely clear. She had felt him watching her from across the garden earlier when she had thought he was admiring the bare winter rose canes along the south wall. He had not been admiring the rose canes. He had the way of watching that she had learned to notice the stillness that preceded attention, and it was a quality she had catalogued with the care of a woman who has been told for 24 years that she is not worth watching. She had learned in the last 4 weeks that this was incorrect information. She had not yet learned to receive the correction easily. She was, however, beginning. She reached into her pocket. The thimble was there. It was always there. She took it out and held it in her gloved palm for a moment in the cold afternoon light. Edmund was standing a few feet away, looking at the frozen rosemary along the south wall, with an attention that she now recognized as the attention he gave to things he was not yet ready to name aloud. His profile in the winter light had the quality of a man who has recently put down something very heavy and is not entirely sure what to do with his hands. She thought of her mother sitting in a cold little church in March, the handwriting careful and exact in the register, the name placed in ink where it could not be unmade. She thought of the 16 years the name had spent buried under another story. She thought of what it had cost no one in particular to bury it, and what it had cost her mother everything to give it, and what it had cost Cecily a great deal of her ordinary life to reclaim it. Edmund turned from the rosemary. He looked at the thimble in her palm. She had not meant to show it to him, but here it was, silver and worn, small in the winter light. "My mother's," she said. He nodded. He did not ask to hold it. He simply understood, in the way she was coming to accept that he understood things, and she found that this too was something she would have to learn to receive. She put the thimble back. The garden gate stood open behind her, the stone arch of it, pale gold in the winter light. She did not go back inside immediately. She stood for one more moment in the cold and the quiet, with the garden around her and the day balanced exactly on the edge of the year's turning, and she let herself believe, without qualification, that the register had done what registers are meant to do, kept the true record, in the end, for the person it belonged to. She went inside. The gate stood open. If Cecily's story moved you, you might leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. Whatever you carry into the new year, carry it honestly. Thank you for being here until the end.